Good morning. Welcome for the youth that are in the service. We have a sheet for you if you want to head to the back now. I will add, there's a mistake on this sheet. Miles questioned me this morning about what passage I was preaching from, and it turns out I'm preaching from the wrong passage. Good news, it's the passage we read. It is in the Bible. I did prepare a sermon on it, and we will spend our time in it. I'm not just winging it this morning. What that means is the passage that is on the youth sheet is next week's sermon, and I've switched them. I'm the boss. I get to make these decisions. It's not my fault. It is my fault, but also we will press on. As we read that passage that we just read, I wonder if you feel the scandal, right? Scandal greater than just preparing the wrong sermon. I wonder if you feel the scandal that's happening in this story, because it is a scandalous story that is going on here. This is the scene, right? This rumour has gotten around about Jesus. In fact, we didn't read this bit, but just a couple of verses earlier, Jesus tells people the rumour that's going around about him. It's the rumour that stories like last week's sermon started. Jesus is eating with tax collectors. And so this is the rumour. Jesus says it in Luke 7:34. He says, people are saying that he's a glutton and a drunkard and friends of tax collectors and other sinners. That's the rumour that's going around, that Jesus is hanging out with scumbags, and that means he's a scumbag himself. And that rumour's getting around. And then something maybe more scandalous happens. A Pharisee, a religious leader of the day, invites Jesus to his house to dinner. You see what's happening here? He's being invited by scumbags, and then a religious leader says, come on over to my place. Now, as we understand it historically speaking, this probably isn't just a private meal with just Jesus and the Pharisee. It's common, it seems, that Pharisees would have invited lots of people over. In fact, even had strangers show up at their house as a kind of large banquet. And so that's the scene we get here, but Jesus has been invited to this banquet. He's there. It's clear he's not a guest of honour. He hasn't been treated with honour, which he points out as a guest of honour, which he points out later. But he's there, he's invited. But that's not the scandal. The scandal isn't that the Pharisee invited a scumbag. The scandal becomes more of a scandal because of a woman who shows up at this scene. We're not told much about her. We're told she's the NLT gives us these words, a certain woman, an immoral woman from that city. Right? The language there tells us people know this woman. They know who she is. She's a certain immoral woman that people are aware of. So you can imagine this scene. They're having dinner. It's a religious leader's house. They've invited the scandalous Jesus there. Probably means there's even more of a bit of an interest going on. And then this woman shows up, and you can imagine the murmur that happens when she enters the room. We don't really know the scene here. We do know some details. We know when they ate meals, they were reclining. They weren't sitting in chairs like we do. It was kind of a lying down, low table situation. That explains a couple of things, like she comes up behind Jesus, but she ends up washing his feet. Like, that's not because she's hiding under a chair on her belly. It's because Jesus is at a table leaning forward with his feet going backwards, right? That's the scene we get. So people are reclined, and so maybe makes sense that no one kind of gets up to stop this woman. It's not an easy step to kind of intercept her on her way to Jesus. But there's another scandal going on, and maybe even more unseemly than her for the people there, and that is Jesus. How does Jesus respond? Here's the rumour. He's hanging out with sinners and tax collectors, and someone they would call a sinner walks into the room. How is Jesus going to respond? In the eyes of all these people, what is he going to do? And what's surprising is he doesn't stop her. And this scene becomes quite an extreme scene. If people haven't noticed her yet, she then opens up a bottle of perfume, And so if you haven't seen the scene, you can now smell the scene in the room, right? Something is happening. Opens up a bottle of perfume. She is crying. We don't know how loud that is, but she's crying. And then her tears are falling on Jesus' feet, and she's washing his feet with her hair. Like, this is a strange thing. Don't be fooled into thinking this is kind of some historical thing. As far as we know in history, it wasn't a thing in Jesus' day that they washed guests' feet with their hair. Okay, that's not a thing that's happening. This is a thing that she's doing in this moment. It's weird, and it's awkward, and it's making everyone comfortable, not just because of who she is, but because of what she's doing. But more scandalous than that is Jesus' response to it. Jesus' response is he lets it happen. Try to picture just how scandalous this is. Let me illustrate this of what it might look like today. You imagine you're in the city and take someone who obviously is a religious leader. Say we got a priest with a clergy collar, visibly a religious guy, shows up, King's Cross, pulls up at the lights, and I don't know if this happens in Australia. I've only seen it in movies, but a prostitute walks over and leans in his window and starts talking to him. Okay, what are you thinking in those moments? You're thinking, this guy could be a fool. He could just be oblivious to what's going on in that moment, like a foolish guy who's just not familiar with the ways of the world. He doesn't know who she is, and he's just chatting to her because he's a kind man and he's trying to do his best, but he's a bit of a fool. So option one is he's a fool. Option two is something scandalous is happening. Option two is he's not just a fool, but he's actually enjoying this, maybe even enjoying the moment of a pretty woman talking to him, but maybe even more scandalous than that. He has hopes or plans for something even more scandalous. Those are the two thoughts that are happening. He either doesn't know what's going on or he knows full well what's going on. Both those answers are scandalous if this is Jesus. Because for someone just at King's Cross in a car, he could be a fool. But Jesus is going around saying he's not only from God, he is God. He can't be the fool. That category doesn't actually work. And that's what happens with Simon the Pharisee as he looks onto this scene. If Jesus is who he says he is, this scene can't happen because it can't be something scandalous. If he is who he says he is, if he's from God, he can't have these plans with this woman that could happen. So it can't be that. And he also can't be the fool because he should have the knowledge of who this person is. So for Simon, in this scene, this is a defining moment of who Jesus is. This scandal is going on. On top of that, it turns out she is the wife of Peter's deceased brother, and they thought she was dead, but she's no, that's Bold and Beautiful. But you understand what's happening here. This is a wild scene that's rolling out, and people are like, what is going on? And who is this Jesus? And Jesus is letting it happen. And the reality is, as we look at the scene, we realise that some of the rumours about Jesus are true. Not all of them. The rumour is that he's having meals with tax collectors and other kinds of sinners. Turns out that's true. He is relating to those kinds of people. The other part of that the rumour is that therefore he's a glutton and a drunkard. That's not true. But part of the story is true. And people are asking the question, who is this guy and what does that mean for who he is? It raises the question for us, I think, what does that look like for us today? People ask the question, if Jesus was here today, who would be the people that he would hang out with? Who are the kind of contemporaries of these scandalous stories? An example you might think recently at the Olympics, the Paris Olympics, if you may have seen this, may have heard about this, there's a scene in the opening ceremony, a meal scene, that people thought was reminiscent of the painting of the Last Supper, right? All these people standing behind the table. The problem was they were drag queens, and it seemed like some sort of political statement about faith and Jesus. The organisers said it was actually about it was a feast of the Olympic gods. So they said it wasn't that. But raised a conversation. And some people said, isn't this, if Jesus was here today, isn't that the kind of people he would have had meals with? And that's an interesting conversation for us to think about. Is that true? Certainly, if we want to think, who are the people that would raise an eyebrow, that would be considered, it's hard for us to, I know we don't like the tax guys, but not the same kind of feelings of the tax collectors in Jesus' day. It does feel like this is the kind of crowd, the scene of drag queens or trans people or non-binary, that kind of people that would feel like not, that the religious crowd wouldn't be comfortable with. That is the equivalent, I think, of this scene. So the question is that the kind of people Jesus would have meals with? And I think the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Jesus welcomes anyone equally who would come to follow him. And Jesus calls everyone equally to deny themselves, turn to him, and follow him. You see, both those things are true. Jesus welcomes anyone equally who would come to follow him, and he calls everyone equally to turn from themselves and to him and follow. Let me just pause on that for a moment and just think a little bit about us in that space. Because I think there's a space here that is difficult for us. We want to be a church, we want to be a people who welcome anyone equally who might come to explore faith amongst us. I hope that is something that is true of us. It's certainly something we want to be true of us, that anyone is welcome. Anyone who wants to come, seek, and follow faith is welcome. That is true. It's also complex because while we want to be a people, and I hope we are a people that welcomes anyone, not all the things we believe are welcomed by anyone. You see that? We want to welcome anyone, but what we believe is not welcomed by everyone. In fact, the strange space we live in at the moment is because our beliefs might not be welcomed by someone else, the claim would be we're no longer a welcoming people, which is tricky. And it raises the question how we process that. We are a church that hold traditional views on marriage, traditional views on sexuality, traditional views on gender, and these are a tricky space for us at the moment. And I wonder what that means for us. I want to say it means we need to walk forward lovingly. We need to walk forward carefully in those relationships. And we need to walk forward in the way we communicate. And we need to walk forward making certain that transformation of the heart is our greatest priority. That people coming to know Jesus is our greatest priority before we have some of those conversations about lifestyle decisions. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes lifestyle decisions are the thing that needs to be processed in order to understand who Jesus is. Those things are intertwined, but we want to work hard that make sure the gospel is our front foot as we think about these things. We are a church who welcomes anyone equally who might come to seek faith amongst us. And we follow Jesus in that because he is one who welcomes anyone equally who comes to follow him, and he calls everyone equally to turn from themselves and turn to him. Let me take us back to this scene a little bit because it's helpful for us to understand some of the underlying that's happening in this scene. There's a question of who this woman is and what her journey in her following Jesus looks like. I think as we read this story, it becomes clear this woman has already turned to follow Jesus. She has already gained some understanding that he is who he says he is, because that's the very reason she's there. Later on in the passage, we get a couple of verses that tell us some of what her faith looks like. For example, verse 50, Jesus says, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Some people would conclude, okay, in that moment, Jesus has offered her salvation. And dangerously, they would say, because of all the things she's done, because she's proven herself to him, at the end of the story, he says, "Great, you proved your faith to me, your sins are forgiven." I think that's not a fair reading of what's happening here. What's happening here is some transformation has already happened to her. Some of the clues to that are the language that happens before that. Jesus tells everyone in the room, verse 47, "I tell you, her sins, and they are many, have been," past tense, "forgiven." This is before he tells her anything. Her sins have been forgiven. "So she has shown me much love." You see what's happening there? Her response is because of what Jesus has done. If that's not clear enough, I think Jesus' parable that he tells us, that he tells the people there, doesn't make sense if we don't read it that way. Because this is the story we get. He tells everyone in the room, there's two guys. One of them owes a debt of 500 pieces of silver, and one owes a debt of 50 pieces of silver, right? They're in different situations, but they have something in common. The common thing is neither of them can ever repay the debt. One's a big debt, one's a little debt. Neither of them can pay it, so they're really in the same boat. The story is they're both forgiven their debt. Jesus says it in verse 42. Neither of them could repay him, so he kindly forgave them both, cancelling their debts. And then he asks a question, and the question is key to understanding the point. There's multiple layers, as usual in Jesus' parable. There's a great illustration of the good news of Jesus in the forgiving of debts, that we, like these two men, have rebelled against God in our own ways, that we can never be made right with this perfect, holy God, but Jesus has come and taken that price so that we can be friends with God. That's the picture Jesus has given in this very short illustration. It's a great illustration of the good news of what Jesus has come to do. But the key to understanding the point of Jesus' illustration is in the question that follows next. He says, "Who do you suppose loved him more after that?" Right? The key to understanding Jesus' illustration is he is raising the point not about the forgiveness, but about the response to the forgiveness. And in that context, this woman can only be someone who has already received forgiveness, who has already come to understand who Jesus is, and she has come at his feet not as a sinner, but as someone who is restored, someone who's come loving Jesus for what he has done for her. And it raises a question for us, I think. What is an adequate celebration for salvation? What is an adequate response to such a profound thing? I think that's a very real question for us as a saved people, as people who profess to be followers of Jesus, who have received this same salvation she has. What is our response to that? I saw this video this week. There was no context given, which seems like a common thing in shorts on the internet at the moment. Anything to try to gain comments in the comment feed. But the video was... It was a church scene, I assume. It was an older bit of footage. And men were running around in this service, I think in an expression of praise, I think. Though I can only describe the scene as it looked like the building was on fire, but they didn't know where the exits were. That looked like what was happening. I've seen a lot of different ways different churches worship. I haven't actually seen that particular style of praise before. I don't want to knock particular expressions of worship. I do want to think a little bit about what is an adequate response? I think, first of all, we would say, above all, we want to make sure that we respond authentically, genuinely. Now I'm not saying those guys weren't genuine, but certainly for us, we would want to ask the question, how do we authentically, genuinely respond in praise? I also think we want to think about how we do it in a way that points other people to Jesus. I think that's really important. There's this phrase, you may have heard it, worship with an audience of one, right? Only God. Just He's your one audience that you should think about as you worship. I want to say that's just not true. That's not a true statement. In fact, Jesus isn't our audience. He's our one object, person of worship. Worship God as your only person, only thing, only being of worship. That is true. But actually, the audience is far broader than that. We should worship in a way that points other people to Jesus. In fact, if we are glorifying God truly, then our worship, our heart, our passion should not be just to respond in praise, but it should be to also point others to respond in praise. And so we worship with one person as our subject of our worship, but we do so also consider it about how we might encourage others in worship. So it should be genuine. It should be encouraging to others, though that can be complex as to what's encouraging to others, because someone standing next to you who doesn't believe in God at all may be totally discouraged by your praise in Him, and I don't think there's necessarily a way around that. Authentic, encouraging to others, but I think we as a church probably need more encouragement on the other end of the spectrum. It seems more common for us as a church to be less over the top and distractingly flamboyant in our worship, and more likely to be, as lovingly coined, the frozen chosen. That we tend to fit that kind of category. Now, I want to be careful here. Some of us here, that does not fit you at all, and I say this to encourage others to support you in your expression of worship. Some of us here, I know this, would love to be more expressive in worship, but either feels like it's pushing the envelope too much, or might be distracting to others, or just feels like they're not free to do that. We have this kind of thing we say in church, you're free to express your worship how you want amongst us, but people don't necessarily feel free to express their worship freely because we are surrounded by each other. And so there's a challenge there for us, and I want to push us to think about that challenge because I think it's clear great truths deserve great emotional response. And so in a world of where we want to express and it's hard to express just how incredible what Jesus has done for us is and the truth that we read in the Bible, we want to try to express that. And I think sometimes we have to work hard at expressing that. And I recognise we're all different in that space. I remember years ago in a church, there was a guy, he was an accountant, and that doesn't sum up everything about him, but maybe that gives you a little bit of a picture. There's a movie that says he's my accountant or lawyer, and sadly he was born without a personality. There was this moment where this guy was just tapping his foot in church, and someone leant over to me and went, "Whoa, the Spirit is moving. If that guy is tapping his foot, that's as extreme as it gets for him." I understand, that is some of us. It's not all of us, and there's a space that we want to live in together as we worship. I find there's something very hard to lead. As the senior minister, they talk about, leadership is you have to lead from the front. And I find it very difficult, personally, to express emotion. Susie will tell you, I have emotion, I've just buried it really deep. A couple of years ago, St Matthew's Anglican Church in Manly gifted us a whole bunch of things, including the chairs you're sitting on. So all the blue chairs in this room, They were demolishing and rebuilding, big building project for them, their hall, and they were refreshing a whole bunch of things. They said, so I went to Manly, and he said, we've cleaned out everything we want. So just, you can walk through and just take anything that you find useful. So we loaded up every chair in the building, and we took all those chairs. Some of the black curtains that are here, they're like, some of them are expensive wool fire retardant curtains. I just like teared them off their walls. We picked up a guitar amp. We picked up a sound desk, which we later on gifted on. I was really thankful. Particularly, we knew that as we grew, we needed to think about buying more chairs. I was really thankful for what he had done, that church had done for us in giving us all that stuff. There was a moment that I could see he was searching my face for my thankfulness. And the more I felt that he was searching my face for the thankfulness, the more I felt like I couldn't genuinely get that out. I don't know what face I was making in that moment. I feel like it got more and more awkward the more I tried, saying, we're so thankful for what you've done for us. I find that very difficult to express emotion at times. And I understand that this is a space that is difficult for some of us, but I just want to encourage us as a church. Great truths deserve great emotional response. And the reality is, as we look in our world around us, there's a number of ways that we would see celebration in our culture, in our traditions around us, that we would say are quite extreme. The classic example is the football, and some of us change personalities when we go to sports. It's a different person comes out of us, and that is to say that some of us actually express our praise and joy far more than we actually think. Weddings are the same thing. Reception parties, a different character sometimes comes out of us than what we see at other times. And it's worth us thinking about. What is genuine response of praise? And I want us to think, this scene that happens in this story is an uncomfortable scene. I think we would be uncomfortable even if we knew what was happening, even if we knew that she had received salvation, even if we were confident Jesus was who he says he was. It's an unusual scene that may make us all uncomfortable. But I think we also need to be a little uncomfortable with the fact that often our response doesn't properly reflect what it is God has done for us. It feels at times like we make sure our hands are in our pockets just in case the Spirit might want to move them up. They're locked down. Or we make sure you hold your hands at the back just to make sure one of them doesn't lose control during the worship and express too much. I think we want to be uncomfortable, rightfully so, that sometimes we are much more on the opposite end of the spectrum and not express our praise appropriately. We need to appreciate and celebrate salvation that we've received. And I want to say too, just as we finish up, I want to encourage you to celebrate your story of salvation and what God has done for you. Often it's easy to see the celebration in a story like this one. A woman who was far from God. We get the story of the prodigal son, right, who goes far from the father, and he squanders his wealth, he disrespects his father in the way he lives, and he hits rock bottom so badly that he's eating with the pigs, and he hits rock bottom so badly that he says, my father, even as a slave, it would be better to be with him, and he heads back. And amazingly, his father takes him back and doesn't accept him back as a slave, but accepts him back as a son. And what a great celebration of salvation that is. What a great celebration of this son who was far from God, far from the Father, and came back and received forgiveness. But there's also two sons in that story. One of them went far from his father and came back. The other one stayed close to his father and yet was far from him. both those stories need their father's forgiveness. Both those stories need their father to draw them back. And when the father draws them back, for both those stories, that is a miraculous experience, a miraculous journey, a miraculous gift from God. It's dangerous that we hear the testimony of the person who says, I went down this path and I was so far from God. We hear the story of the gangster who came back to God. We hear the story of the sex worker who gave their life to Jesus and had it transformed. And we're actually in danger of envying those stories because how radical their forgiveness was and how much they experienced God's grace. And I think we're in danger sometimes of taking what some of our stories look like, growing up in a Christian home maybe, and having people share Jesus to you in your whole life. My testimony is that there isn't really a day in my life that I didn't know Jesus. I have moments in my life where I feel like I made significant decisions, but I feel like my whole life I've known Jesus. We have danger of kind of being envious of that miraculous story and forgetting the great gift it might be for you if you had those opportunities, that God protected you from not going down that path, that by God's grace you grew up in a space where you didn't head into place. You didn't need to hit rock bottom, that God might bring you back. What an incredible gift of glory that is. And so I want to encourage you, whether your story is the one who was far from God and came near, or your story was the one that was near to God and came in, either of those stories are worthy of celebration. And so let's be a people who celebrate the salvation, the mercy, the gift, the grace we've received. Let's be a people who celebrate that in a way that encourages others to celebrate that. When we sing out together, we are encouraging each other to sing out. When you proclaim the goodness of God in song or in any way that we do in church together, you are proclaiming that to God, but you're also proclaiming that to the people beside you. We are singing out, we are lifting our praises to the one who is worthy of praise. So I want to encourage you. As Jesus is having meals with people, don't stand near and not walk into the room and join him. And if you are someone who has chosen to follow Jesus, then celebrate your story, celebrate what he has done, celebrate who he is. Let's be a people who celebrate genuinely and authentically in a way that encourages others towards Jesus.